What happens when a powerful CEO is treated like just another nobody while flying on his own airline? The shocking truth that unfolds will challenge everything you thought you knew about respect, fairness, and the truth hiding in plain sight. Gerald Bennett leaned back in his sleek leather chair, eyes locked on the sprawling Los Angeles skyline. At 48, he had risen from modest beginnings to become the CEO of Stella Airlines, a company he had nurtured, bled for, and devoted over a decade of his life to. Yet, despite all his success, a nagging unease had settled into his bones. Complaints had started circulating, customers grumbling about poor service, some even accusing the airline of favoritism and rude staff. Reviews from a few praised the airline, but the dark whispers were getting louder. Gerald knew he couldn't just sit in his ivory tower reading reports. He needed to see for himself, to experience firsthand what was really happening. That's when it hit him, a plan so simple, yet so radical. He would blend in. No suits. No assistants. No fanfare. Just Gerald, the passenger, anonymous and unnoticed. This wasn't about policies, procedures, or company image. It was deeply personal. He wanted to feel what every ordinary traveler felt. The frustration, the joy, the indignities. This wasn't just about Stella Wings anymore, it was about how people were treated when no one knew who they were. The plan was set in motion. Gerald would book a first-class ticket under an assumed name, wear his most unremarkable clothes, and leave behind his usual entourage, luxury car, and VIP perks. He chuckled as he grabbed an old, worn-out duffel bag from the closet, a stark contrast to the polished briefcases he normally carried. He hadn't flown solo in years. His assistant raised an eyebrow, questioning his sudden absence from the office, but said nothing more. Gerald didn't want anyone to know about this. He needed this to be raw, unfiltered, and honest. At 6 a.m., Gerald arrived at LAX, blending in with the sea of travelers hustling through the airport. His faded jeans and black hoodie made him invisible, at least, that's what he thought. As he stepped into the terminal, a flutter of anticipation rose in his chest. What would he find? Were the complaints just an overreaction, or were there deeper issues at play? He wasn't sure, but he was ready to discover the truth. Little did he know, things were about to take a turn he could never have expected. The buzz of LAX was deafening, a symphony of rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and the occasional frustrated sigh. Gerald joined the line at the self-service kiosk, something he hadn't done in years. Inserting his credit card, he retrieved his boarding pass, eyes scanning the screen. First-class seat, 2A. Perfect. He tucked the ticket into his pocket, grabbed his bag, and made his way toward security. That's when he noticed it, a small but strange detail. A man in a tailored suit breezed through the TSA checkpoint without so much as a glance. Seconds later, a mother traveling with two small children was asked to remove nearly everything from her carry-on bag. Gerald frowned, his instincts kicking in. Was it just a coincidence? Or was something deeper at play? As he placed his belongings in the gray plastic bin, he overheard the agent speaking to the woman ahead of him. "Ma'am, this line is for pre-check passengers only. Please move to the regular line." Her words were sharp, and the woman's embarrassment was palpable. She looked back briefly, her eyes meeting Gerald's, before she shuffled away, toddler in tow. Gerald passed through security without issue, but something inside him tightened. The woman's expression haunted him. He tried to brush it off. There was no point in overthinking just yet. His real test was still ahead. Arriving at Gate 37A, Gerald found the lounge area buzzing with life, families juggling strollers, business travelers glued to their screens, college students discussing spring break plans. He quietly found a seat near the boarding door, settling in, his eyes observing every interaction around him. It wasn't long before he noticed the subtle dynamics at play. A middle-aged couple approached the counter to inquire about their upgrade status. The gate agent greeted them warmly, checking their details with a smile. Moments later, an elderly man approached with a simple question, but his treatment was noticeably different. Dismissive. Curt. Gerald's stomach churned slightly, but he reserved judgment for now. When the boarding announcement finally crackled over the intercom, Gerald grabbed his ticket and joined the first-class line. The young gate agent barely glanced at his boarding pass before raising an eyebrow. "Sir, this line is for first-class passengers only," she said, her voice clipped. Gerald smiled politely and handed her the ticket. "I know. That's me." She scanned the ticket, then paused, her eyes lingering on him for a moment too long. The silence hung thick in the air before she scanned it again with a terse beep. "One moment," she muttered, stepping aside to make a call. Gerald's pulse quickened. Behind him, whispers began to swirl, quiet but growing louder. He could hear fragments of conversation. What's going on? Did he try to sneak in? Why are they holding him up? The agent returned, her demeanor colder than before. "I'm going to need to verify some information with security," she said, motioning for Gerald to step aside. Gerald blinked in disbelief. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" She didn't answer. Instead, she gestured for the next passenger to step forward. The man behind Gerald, impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, handed over his ticket. He was waved through with ease, no hesitation, no questions. Gerald's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he kept his cool, his heart hammering in his chest. As he stood to the side, clutching his duffel bag, the tension in the air grew thick. Passengers filed past, some stealing curious glances, others staring openly. The whispers, once subtle, became louder, feeding into a growing sense of unease. Then, a security officer arrived, his imposing presence adding weight to the situation. "Is there an issue here?" the officer asked, eyeing both Gerald and the gate agent. "Yes," the agent replied, her voice sharp, a quickness in her response that seemed almost rehearsed. "I need to verify his ticket and identification. Something doesn't seem right." Gerald's brow furrowed. "Something doesn't seem right?" His voice, calm yet laced with tension, met her with a quiet firmness. "I've shown you my ticket. What exactly is the problem?" The gate agent faltered for just a moment, the uncertainty creeping into her once steady gaze. Gerald's pulse began to rise, but he refused to let it show. Before she could answer, the officer stepped forward. "Sir, I need to see your ID," he said, his tone official, his stance unyielding. Gerald handed over his driver's license without a hint of hesitation, not protesting, though every muscle in his body tensed as the officer scrutinized it. The officer glanced at the ID, then back at Gerald. "Everything seems fine," he muttered, handing it back. But the gate agent wasn't finished. "I still think we should confirm with management. This is a first-class ticket," and she faltered, words failing her. "And what?" Gerald's patience snapped, his voice a low, biting question. "Do I not look like someone who belongs in first class?" The words cut through the tension like a knife, hanging in the air, sharp and undeniable. The agent's face flushed, and her eyes darted to the officer, who now looked uncertain, unsure of how to proceed. Behind them, the whispers from the line began, growing louder with every passing second. "What's going on? Is he trying to sneak in? Why are they holding him up?" Gerald stood still, his hand gripping the handle of his duffel bag. His heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, but he forced himself to remain calm. He couldn't ignore the glances now being thrown his way, the stares that were becoming impossible to ignore. The murmurs were no longer subtle, they were becoming an undeniable force, the air thick with the tension of the moment. And then, like a flash of recognition in a storm, he saw her, Carla, his assistant, pushing through the crowd, waving a document as she rushed toward the gate. "Excuse me," Carla's voice rang out, slicing through the tension. "What's going on here?" The agent's defensive tone responded almost immediately. "This gentleman's ticket is under review." But Carla's face changed in an instant, her confusion giving way to quiet, simmering anger. "Under review," she repeated, disbelief coloring her words as she handed the agent a document. The agent unfolded it, her face draining of color as she read. The paper was official, a letter identifying Gerald Bennett as the CEO of Stella Wings Airlines, signed and sealed. The gate agent's mouth fell open, but no words came out. The officer, too, stepped back, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Gerald raised his hand before anyone could speak. "It's not about realizing who I am," he said quietly, but with a weight that made the words feel heavier than they should have been. "It's about how you treat people when you think they're nobody." The quiet gasps that spread throughout the terminal made the silence at Gate 37A feel deafening. All eyes were on Gerald now, a mix of shock and realization flickering across the crowd. The gate agent, trembling slightly, fumbled with his boarding pass, offering it back. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Bennett. I didn't know." Gerald accepted the pass, his face unreadable, but his voice unwavering as he spoke again. You didn't know because I didn't want you to. Today, I wasn't flying as the CEO of this airline. I was flying as a customer, just like everyone else here. The murmurs that had once been whispers now filled the air, louder than before. Some passengers exchanged stunned looks, others started talking in hushed tones, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and intrigue. Gerald turned to face them, his voice carrying over the terminal. He spoke with authority, yes, but there was something in his tone that spoke of genuine care. "Let me tell you why I'm here," he began, addressing the crowd. "I wanted to see how my airline treats people when no one is watching. Not when a suit walks in, not when someone's status is plastered all over the system, but when it's just an ordinary person walking up to that gate." He paused, scanning the faces around him, letting his words sink in. "And what I've seen today, what many of you have probably experienced, is unacceptable." The gate agent, her shoulders slumped, lowered her head. She couldn't meet his gaze. Gerald turned back to her, his tone softening but still firm. "This isn't about me. This is about the countless people who've stood in this line, shown their ticket, and been made to feel like they didn't belong." He leaned in slightly, his eyes locking with hers. "You weren't rude to me because I'm Gerald Bennett, but how many others have you dismissed without a second thought?" The agent nodded silently, her face flushed with a quiet, raw embarrassment. Gerald stood a little taller, addressing the entire gate staff now, his voice steady. "We can't build a successful company on empty promises or glossy advertisements. It's built right here, at moments like this, by the way we treat every single person who walks through those doors." He let his words hang for a moment, giving the weight of them a chance to settle in. "This isn't just a lesson for you. It's a lesson for all of us. Judging people by appearances, by assumptions, it's a habit we've got to break." Just as he finished speaking, a passenger in the crowd stood up. The sound of slow, deliberate clapping began. The applause spread like wildfire, the sound rising and echoing through the gate area. Gerald raised his hand, signaling for the crowd to quiet down. The applause slowed, but Gerald's voice carried, steady and clear. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere but filled with purpose. "But this isn't about applauding me. It's about reflecting on how we treat each other. Every single one of us here has been on both sides of this equation, judged unfairly or judging someone else without knowing their story." He paused, his gaze shifting back to the gate agent, now visibly shaken. "What matters is what we do next. How we choose to change." The young woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling with regret. "I didn't mean—" Gerald gently interrupted her. "I know," he said, his voice soft, but the message was still firm. "And it's not just you. Bias isn't always intentional, but the harm it causes is real. What's important now is learning from it, and making sure it doesn't happen again." The crowd seemed to let out a collective sigh, as if the weight of the moment had finally been lifted. Gerald shifted his gaze toward the passengers who had witnessed the exchange. "To those of you who saw this unfold today," he began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight, "I hope this serves as a reminder, we're all deserving of respect. No matter our appearance, our background, or the size of our bank accounts." A woman in the crowd, emboldened by the tension that had just been released, spoke up, her words ringing clear and strong. "You handled this with grace. Most people would have blown up." Gerald's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes revealed the depth of the moment. "I'm not saying I wasn't frustrated," he admitted. "I was. But anger doesn't change anything, it just builds walls. It's conversations like this, though, uncomfortable as they are, that spark real change." The security officer, who had been standing at the periphery of the scene, stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett, I'd like to personally apologize as well," he said, his voice tinged with genuine regret. "I didn't mean to escalate things." Gerald nodded, his tone softening, though still firm. "I appreciate that," he replied. "And I hope this moment helps us all think twice about how we approach situations like this in the future." As the gate finally opened for boarding, Gerald stepped forward to take his place in the line. This time, his path was met with smiles and words of appreciation, though the tension that had hung in the air moments before still lingered, far more powerful than any flight could be. Once settled into his first-class seat, Gerald couldn't ignore the shift that had taken place. There was an unspoken change in the atmosphere. Passengers who had witnessed the event exchanged glances, some murmuring quietly among themselves, others approaching Gerald as they passed by. "Thank you for what you said back there," a young man murmured, his voice low, his words full of respect. "I've been in situations like that. It's hard to speak up." Gerald offered him a warm smile. Sometimes, speaking up is the only way forward. As the plane taxied down the runway, Gerald found himself replaying the events in his mind. He hadn't intended to cause a scene, that was never the goal. But the moment had offered an opportunity, a chance he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the gate agent or the security officer, it was about the system. A mindset that needed to be challenged. A culture that needed to evolve. By the time the plane landed, word of the incident had spread like wildfire. Several passengers had posted about it on social media, sharing their shock and admiration for how Gerald had handled the situation. One tweet went viral: "Witness the CEO of Stellar Wings stand up against bias today. Incredible grace under pressure. We need more leaders like him." Back at the office, Gerald called an emergency meeting with his executive team. He recounted the experience in vivid detail, recounting every uncomfortable moment, every difficult interaction, and what those moments revealed about their airline. "If we're serious about being the best," he said firmly, "it starts with accountability. Training. Hiring practices. Customer interactions. Everything." The room fell silent. Some of his team nodded, others furrowed their brows, deep in thought. Gerald could feel the weight of his words sinking in. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was the first step. But Gerald knew that the real work didn't stop at his desk. It wasn't just internal. It was about sparking conversations far beyond the walls of the company. The days following the incident saw a surge of discussions about bias, accountability, and respect. News outlets quickly picked up the story, framing it as an example of leadership that transcended profit margins and policies. Gerald was invited to speak at panels, and his team rolled out a comprehensive initiative to tackle the issues he had uncovered. For Gerald, it was never about the spotlight. It was about using his platform to inspire real change, not just within his company, but across the industry. Stella Wings soon implemented mandatory training for all employees, with a focus on unconscious bias and customer empathy. They also launched a program to encourage passengers to share their experiences, ensuring that every voice was heard. Weeks later, Gerald received a letter from the gate agent. It was handwritten, the words heartfelt, raw. She thanked him for his patience and for showing her that change was possible. "I've thought about that day over and over," she wrote. "It taught me more than any training session ever could. I'm working to be better, and I want you to know I'm grateful for the lesson." Gerald folded the letter, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't about absolution, it was about progress. One moment. One conversation. One decision to stand up for what's right. That was how change began. As he reflected on everything that had transpired, Gerald realized the true moral of the story: leadership isn't about titles or power. It's about setting an example, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about treating every individual with the dignity they deserve, whether they're the CEO or just someone trying to board a plane. So, the next time you witness someone being dismissed, mistreated, or overlooked, ask yourself, how can I make a difference? Because, in the end, change begins with us.